Hi, everybody. Back with the Post-American World, Chapter 5, The Ally. This is a chapter on India. It's fairly straightforward, and having read China, you'll see that it follows the same general structure, so it should be fairly easy. Also, ratings are slipping, only 34 views in the last chapter, so I'm going to go quickly through this one. See if we can't, move fast. Okay. He begins with a story of leaving India in 1982 to come to America to go to college, and he compares the period before 1982 with the period since 1997, and it's very similar to the story in China after Deng Xiaoping's speech in 1979 saying China is going to move forward with market reforms. By the same token, India begins to move from an old-style socialist country to a modern global player in the globalized world. Okay. His next section is bottoms up, and he begins by saying, well, if you've been to India, it doesn't look at all like what I've just described. It looks horrible, and there's lots and lots of poor people. But he says, actually, the reason for that is that, unlike China, India is a democracy, and things are much messier. Yes, people have come up out of poverty, but India is behind China, and part of the reason it's behind China is that it's this chaotic democracy. There isn't simple, straightforward planning that allows them to move very quickly to develop infrastructure. He also says, actually, infrastructure is less important. If you don't have good roads, as they don't have in India, instead they use the information superhighway, and they deliver services to the first world instead of goods. His next section is the necessity of government, and here he's telling us that even though India's government's really bad, it's actually necessary, and that democracy is necessary. So he's going to go through a whole lot of interesting things about India's Communist Party, for example, and the role of Muslims in India, and he's going to say, yeah, it's really bad, but there have been stealth reforms, and for example, on page 144 at the bottom, he says, in any event, there is no other way. That's a direct quote from Margaret Thatcher when she said that there is no other way but to move forward with the kind of market revolution she was proposing and brought to fruition in Great Britain. Okay. He says also in here that it is society pushing the state, that the state has not kept up with the excitement and the exuberance of society now moving towards greater democracy, greater freedom, and greater market reform. One of the great quotes I love in here is he says, he quotes somebody saying, at night when the government sleeps, the economy grows, right? So the government has been getting in the way. Nevertheless, no matter how bad he says the government is, he says there's a role for government, and this is an important point. Next section is called Blind and Toothless, and this is from a quote about the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the old biblical idea about fighting and justice. And he says, well, if we go, the Indians felt if they went into the world that way and engaged in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the world would very quickly be blind and toothless. So that's where he gets his phrase. But his point is that the Indians in the past have always had a moralistic foreign policy. Not Christian the way the Americans have, but moralistic in the sense of nonviolent and peace-loving and all of that. And he also says that there was a lot of kind of flowery language and a lot of rhetoric, but not a lot of action. And it's worth comparing what he says about China. He says China was bristly and difficult for its neighbors in the past, and now it is much less so, much less ideological. So he really picks on the Indians for this foreign policy, for this very morally upstanding foreign policy. And one of the things you should ask yourself is whether or not you think he's fair in doing that. Okay. His next section is the eagle and the cow, an obvious refrain from the eagle and the dragon, or the dragon and the eagle in the last chapter. And here he's saying, he's not talking about a conflict as he was between the dragon and the eagle, but he's talking about two societies that have a huge known number of interconnections, particularly because there's so many Indians in America and because they share a common language and we share a lot of cultural values. Next section is the Hindu worldview, and here, like the Confucian worldview, he's saying actually it's very, very practical. There's no God involved, and Hinduism is a very disparate and diverse philosophy, more so than a religion. Okay, and he likes the example of Muslims in India. Muslims in India have not participated in the same kinds of Al-Qaeda activities that Muslims in Pakistan, for example, have engaged in. The next section is nuclear power. This is about nuclear non-proliferation. I'd like you to know about nuclear non-proliferation. I'd like you to know the basic facts of India's role in that, but this is not the most important section for us and for our purposes. Next is a geographic expression, and here the point is simply that India is barely a country. India is a disparate society, thousands of different languages, lots of different kinds of people, and the idea that it could ever be like China, a single unified state, is perhaps crazy. So he concludes with that section. He's saying India can capitalize on its advantages, a vast growing economy, an attractive political democracy, a vibrant model of secularism and tolerance, a keen knowledge of both East and West, and a special relationship with America. And he makes a lot of the fact that the Indians have a history with Great Britain and speak English and have good connections with America, very unlike the United States. He concludes the chapter by setting it up for the next section, which is, okay, so here's the world I've just painted. How is America going to respond? All right, that's 7 minutes. Bye-bye.